President Trump is asking the Supreme Court to let him fire a federal trade commissioner. A lower court ruled Rebecca Slaughter's removal was illegal and ordered her reinstated. The D.C. Circuit Court upheld that decision this week, saying FTC commissioners can only be removed for cause such as neglect or malfeasance. Slaughter sued after Trump terminated her and another Democratic commissioner in March. Her case is now the second in weeks to test whether Trump has legal grounds to remove federal regulators. The president is also trying to remove a Federal Reserve Board Governor Lisa Cook.
All right, folks, I need you to stop everything you're doing right now, because what I'm about to tell you is absolutely massive. President Trump is heading into one of the most consequential Supreme Court battles of his entire presidency, and the outcome could fundamentally reshape how our government works for generations to come. We're talking about a case that could hand the president unprecedented power over every single federal agency in America or deal a devastating blow to his entire second-term agenda. And here's what makes this even more explosive. This isn't just one case we're dealing with. President Trump is facing multiple Supreme Court showdowns at the exact same time, and they're all converging right now in December 2025 in a way that could change everything about American government. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest, you can't really trust mainstream media anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us. Be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video.
So this goes back to March. Shortly after the president took office, he sought to fire the two Democratic commissioners on the Federal Trade Commission, or the FTC. And so since then, there has been a lot of legal back and forth, and particularly this ruling is about Rebecca Slaughter. So she is the one that has continued to take up this legal claim, saying that the president cannot fire her without cause. Now, the Supreme Court is likely going to take up this case, but what this does with this ruling is, while they are considering the case, the firing can go forward. So she is being kept away from her post, and that's just sort of an interim type of thing. It will ultimately rest with the Supreme Court's decision of whether she can return or not. But the broader takeaway here is this notion of cause. And you and I have talked about this before when we're talking about the Federal Reserve governor.
The first case is Trump versus Slaughter, and oral arguments are happening Monday, December 8th. At the heart of this case is whether President Trump can fire the heads of independent agencies like the Federal Trade Commission whenever he wants, for any reason or no reason at all. The Supreme Court is being asked to overturn a 90-year-old precedent called Humphrey's Executor that has protected the independence of agencies like the FTC, the Federal Reserve, and dozens of others since 1935. If the conservative majority sides with Trump, which they've signaled they very well might do, it would be the biggest expansion of presidential power in modern American history. We're talking about the president gaining total control over agencies that were specifically designed by Congress to be insulated from political pressure and partisan influence. But wait, there's more happening at the exact same time that makes this situation even more explosive. The Supreme Court also has to rule on whether President Trump's sweeping tariffs are even legal in the first place. Lower courts have already said no. They've ruled that Trump exceeded his authority under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act when he imposed blanket tariffs on imports from nearly every country in the world. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has admitted the government might have to refund somewhere between $750 billion and $1 trillion to importers if the court rules against Trump on this one. Think about that number for a second. We're talking about potentially the largest government refund in American history. And justices from across the ideological spectrum appeared deeply skeptical of Trump's legal position during oral arguments back in November. This is a president who has spent his entire second term trying to consolidate power in the executive branch in ways we've never seen before. He fired 17 inspectors general in the middle of the night during his first weekend back in office, the very watchdogs whose job is to root out waste, fraud, and abuse in government agencies. He's been firing Democratic appointees from independent boards left and right, the National Labor Relations Board, the Merit Systems Protection Board, the Consumer Product Safety Commission, and now the Federal Trade Commission. The Supreme Court has let him get away with most of it through emergency orders on what legal experts call the shadow docket, but now they have to actually decide the law on the merits. And Justice Elena Kagan has been warning in dissent after dissent that her conservative colleagues are handing full control of independent agencies to the president, even though Congress explicitly said the president cannot fire these officials without cause. The stakes here could not possibly be higher for the future of American democracy. if Trump wins these cases, every future president will have the power to fire anyone in the executive branch for any reason whatsoever. The Federal Reserve could become a political tool subject to presidential whims on interest rates. The FTC could become nothing more than an arm of the White House doing the bidding of whoever occupies the Oval Office. Agencies that are supposed to make decisions based on facts and expertise and the rule of law would instead answer only to one person, the President of the United States. Critics are calling this the end of the administrative state as we know it, the dismantling of a century of carefully constructed checks and balances. Supporters say it's simply restoring the Constitution's original design and reclaiming power that was improperly taken from the presidency. Either way, we're about to find out which vision of America the Supreme Court prefers, and the answer will affect every single one of us. Okay, so let me walk you through exactly what's happening here, because the details really matter, and they're absolutely fascinating when you understand the full picture. Let's start with the slaughter case, since that's the one being argued this Monday, and it's the most immediate threat to how our government has worked for nearly a century. Back in March 2025, just weeks after President Trump took office for his second term, he fired 2 Democratic commissioners from the Federal Trade Commission. Their names were Rebecca Kelly Slaughter and Alvaro Bedoya, both of whom had been appointed by President Biden and still had years left on their terms. Trump didn't claim they did anything wrong. He didn't say they were inefficient or neglected their duties or committed any kind of misconduct whatsoever. His only stated reason was that their continued service was inconsistent with his administration's priorities. In other words, he fired them simply because they were Democrats who might not go along with what he wanted to do at the agency. That's it. That was the whole justification. Here's the problem with that approach. Federal law says the president can only remove FTC commissioners for 3 specific reasons: inefficiency, neglect of duty, or malfeasance in office. Policy disagreement is absolutely not on that list of acceptable grounds for removal. Congress wrote those protections into law specifically to keep the FTC independent from political pressure, to ensure that decisions about antitrust enforcement and consumer protection would be made based on the facts and the law rather than which party controls the White House at any given moment. And in 1935, the Supreme Court unanimously upheld those protections in a landmark case called Humphrey's Executor versus United States that has governed how independent agencies work ever since. That case came about when President Franklin Roosevelt tried to fire an FTC commissioner named William Humphrey just because Humphrey was a conservative Republican who disagreed with Roosevelt's New Deal policies. Roosevelt wanted commissioners who would go along with his agenda. Sound familiar? The Supreme Court unanimously said no. Congress can create independent agencies whose leaders are protected from at-will firing by the president. The Constitution does not give the president unlimited power to remove anyone he wants from the executive branch. That has been the settled law of the land for 90 years through Republican and Democratic administrations alike. That 90-year-old precedent is now directly on the chopping block. Commissioner Slaughter sued to get her job back, and a federal district judge named Lauren Ali Khan ruled in her favor in July 2025. The judge said her firing was unlawful under existing Supreme Court precedent and ordered her reinstated to her position at the FTC. But then Trump's legal team asked the Supreme Court to step in on an emergency basis. And here's where things got really interesting and frankly quite alarming to observers. In a 6-3 decision along ideological lines, the conservative majority didn't just put the lower court's order on hold temporarily. They agreed to take up the whole case on the merits, skipping the appeals court entirely in an unusual procedural move, and schedule oral arguments for early December. And they specifically told both sides to address whether Humphrey's executor should be overruled entirely. That last part is the tell that has legal experts so concerned. The Supreme Court doesn't usually ask parties to brief whether they should overturn a major long-standing precedent unless some of the justices are seriously considering doing exactly that. It's a signal and not a subtle one. Justice Kagan, joined by Justices Sotomayor and Jackson, wrote a blistering dissent warning about exactly what's happening here. She pointed out that Congress passed a law saying the president cannot fire FTC commissioners without cause. To reach a different result, she wrote, requires reversing the rule stated in Humphrey's Executor. Although her colleagues in the majority may be raring to take that action, she said, until they actually overturn Humphrey's, it is still good law and should be followed. But here's what's so alarming to critics of the administration and defenders of agency independence. The conservative majority hasn't waited for a final ruling on the merits to let Trump fire these officials and take control of these agencies. Through a series of emergency orders on what's called the shadow docket, they've already allowed Trump to remove Democratic members from the NLRB, the Merit Systems Protection Board, and the Consumer Product Safety Commission, all while the legal challenges were still pending. Each time, the three liberal justices have dissented in increasingly frustrated terms, and each time Justice Kagan has warned that her colleagues are handing full control of independent agencies to the president, state order by state order, before they've even decided whether it's constitutional to do so. The implications, if Humphrey's executor actually falls, are absolutely enormous and would affect nearly every aspect of American life. We're talking about agencies that touch everything you do. The Federal Trade Commission protects consumers from monopolies and unfair business practices and deceptive advertising. The Securities and Exchange Commission regulates Wall Street and protects investors from fraud. The Federal Communications Commission oversees radio, television, the internet, and decides who can use the public airwaves. The National Labor Relations Board protects workers' rights to organize and bargain collectively with their employers. And perhaps most importantly, the Federal Reserve controls monetary policy and interest rates for the entire American economy, decisions that affect your mortgage rate and your job prospects and the value of your retirement savings. Now, the conservative majority did carve out an interesting and somewhat puzzling exception in one of their earlier rulings on this issue. They specifically said the Federal Reserve is a uniquely structured quasi-private entity that follows a distinct historical tradition going back to the first and second banks of the United States. Justice Kagan mocked this in her dissent, calling it a bespoke exception designed to reassure the financial markets rather than a principled legal distinction that makes any sense. But it does suggest that even this aggressively conservative court might not be willing to give the president total control over absolutely everything in the executive branch. Let's talk about the tariff case now, because that's the other shoe waiting to drop. And it could actually be worse for Trump than the agency case in some ways. Back in April 2025, President Trump declared what he called Liberation Day and imposed sweeping tariffs on imports from nearly every country in the world. He used the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA, claiming that trade deficits and fentanyl trafficking constituted national emergencies that justified the tariffs under his emergency powers. Lower courts looked at this argument and said he went way too far. They ruled that IEEPA doesn't actually mention tariffs anywhere in its text, and that the power to impose tariffs is fundamentally the power to tax, which the Constitution gives exclusively to Congress under Article 1, not to the President. The Supreme Court heard oral arguments on this case in early November, and it genuinely did not go well for the administration by all accounts. Multiple justices, including some of the conservatives who usually side with executive power, expressed deep skepticism about the government's legal position. Justice Amy Coney Barrett pressed the Solicitor General to identify any other statute in American history where the phrase regulate importation has been interpreted to include tariff authority, and he couldn't come up with a single example. Justice Sotomayor and Chief Justice Roberts both emphasized that tariffs generate revenue from American citizens, which implicates Congress's core taxing power under the Constitution, not just a regulatory function the president can exercise on his own. Legal analysts who watch the arguments closely are predicting the court might actually rule against Trump by a lopsided margin, possibly 7-2 or even broader than that. The most conservative justices, Thomas Alito and Gorsuch, all have strong concerns about separation of powers and congressional prerogatives that could lead them to side with the challengers on this one. If that happens, Treasury Secretary Bessent has already admitted publicly that the government might have to refund importers somewhere between $750 billion and $1 trillion in tariffs that were collected. Companies like Costco and Bumblebee Foods have already filed claims with Customs and Border Protection, betting that the tariffs will ultimately be struck down and they'll get their money back. The administration does have backup plans if they lose this case. Bessent said they could try to reimpose the tariffs under different legal authorities, like Section 301, which deals with unfair trade practices, or Section 232, which deals with national security threats to specific industries, both of which have their own procedures and limitations. But those statutes are far less flexible than IEEPA, and switching to them could require new investigations and formal findings and extended comment periods that would take months or even years to complete properly. In the meantime, the administration's entire trade policy will be thrown into complete chaos and uncertainty. So what does all this mean for President Trump, and more importantly, for the country going forward? Well, we're at a genuine inflection point in American constitutional history. The decisions the Supreme Court makes in these cases will define the balance of power between the president and Congress for decades to come, long after Trump himself has left office. If the court overturns Humphrey's executor and embraces the full unitary executive theory that the administration is pushing, every president going forward will have essentially unchecked power over the entire executive branch of the federal government. They could fire anyone for any reason at any time, regardless of what Congress says. Independent agencies would be independent in name only. They would answer directly to the president on every decision. The people making crucial decisions about antitrust enforcement, banking regulation, securities fraud, labor rights, consumer protection, and so much more would all serve entirely at the pleasure of the president. Democrats and many legal scholars are warning this would be a giant leap toward authoritarianism. Senator Alyssa Slotkin, who used to work as a CIA analyst studying foreign governments, compared the mass firings of agency officials to what happens in authoritarian countries like China. Representative Seth Moulton, a former Marine officer who served in Iraq, said it's a recipe not just for a politicized government, but for an authoritarian one that looks like how things work in Russia and China and North Korea. Supporters of Trump's approach see things very differently, of course. They argue the Constitution clearly vests all executive power in the president and the president alone, and that independent agencies are actually unconstitutional fourth branches of government that were never supposed to exist in the first place. Legal scholars like John Yoo, who helped develop the unitary executive theory during the George W. Bush administration and wrote the controversial torture memos, say the president must have the ability to command everyone in the executive branch because the power to remove is really the power to direct. From this perspective, Trump isn't grabbing power that doesn't belong to him. He's simply reclaiming power that was improperly taken from the presidency by Congress over the past century of administrative state expansion. The truth is, 5 of the 9 justices currently sitting on the Supreme Court were executive branch lawyers in the Reagan and George W. Bush administrations, whose legal teams specifically focused on developing theories and strategies to expand presidential power. This is the same court that last year gave Trump absolute immunity from criminal prosecution for official acts committed while in office, a decision that stunned legal observers and critics alike. This is the court that has been systematically dismantling the administrative state through rulings on everything from environmental regulations to the structure of oversight agencies to how much deference courts should give to agency interpretations of law. The trajectory is crystal clear, even if the ultimate destination remains somewhat uncertain. What's remarkable is that even this aggressively conservative court might actually hand Trump a significant defeat on the tariff question. The oral argument suggested deep skepticism about the administration's sweeping claim that IEEPA gives the president unlimited power to impose any tariffs he wants without any congressional check whatsoever. Multiple justices from across the ideological spectrum, conservatives and liberals, alike question whether the word regulate can really be stretched to include taxing American importers, especially when Congress has passed detailed statutes governing exactly how the president can address trade deficits and national security concerns through legitimate channels. If the court rules against Trump on tariffs, it would be a major rebuke to his economic agenda and the centerpiece of his trade policy, and potentially cost the government hundreds of billions of dollars in refunds to businesses that paid those tariffs. There's also the deeply concerning question of what happens if Trump loses on one or both of these cases and simply refuses to comply with the court's ruling. We've already seen troubling signs from this administration on that front. Vice President Vance has publicly stated that judges aren't allowed to control the executive branch's legitimate power, suggesting the administration might simply ignore court orders it disagrees with. We've seen Trump post on social media that he who saves his country does not violate any law, invoking language that critics say sounds more like Napoleon Bonaparte than an American president operating under the rule of law. The courts ultimately have no army or police force to enforce their rulings against a defiant president. If a president simply decides not to comply with a Supreme Court decision, the only remedy available under the Constitution is impeachment, and Republicans in Congress have shown absolutely no appetite for holding this president accountable for anything whatsoever. The next few weeks will be absolutely critical for the future of American government. Oral arguments in the Slaughter case happen Monday, December 8th, and the whole country should be paying attention. The tariff ruling could come any day now and could upend the entire economy if it goes against the administration. And behind all of these individual cases, there's the fundamental question of what kind of government we're going to have going forward in this country. A government where independent experts make decisions based on facts and law, insulated from political pressure and the whims of whoever happens to be president. Or a government where everything from antitrust enforcement to interest rates to labor protections to consumer safety flows directly from the will of one person sitting in the Oval Office. I'll be watching closely as these cases unfold, and you can bet I'll be covering every single development as it happens. Because whatever the Supreme Court decides in these cases is going to affect every single one of us in profound ways we're only beginning to understand. The power of the president to control your life, your economy, your workplace, your consumer protections is literally being decided right now by 9 justices in Washington, and the answer they give could change everything about how America works for generations to come. That's it for this video. Drop a comment below. Let me know what you think about this massive power grab and these consequential Supreme Court cases. Do you trust the Supreme Court to get this right? Is Trump restoring the Constitution or destroying it? Subscribe if you haven't already so you don't miss what happens next, and I'll see you in the next one.